Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and joining us today. We are very interested in going behind the headlines these days about what is going on in South America. I know it's been somewhat eclipsed by some little war somewhere in the Middle East, it has to do with some kind of water body or something. Anyway, um, the point that I'd like to make is that the national security document really emphasizes the importance of South America in the American security strategy. And so now what we're trying to do is deconstruct a little bit about what's going on. We have a lot of noise about blowing up little boats and then decapitating leaders, and not in the literal sense. They haven't started with the guillotines yet, but perhaps soon. And although if you were in Iran, you did get the guillotine, as they say. However, what we're trying to do is actually get into the sort of deeper realities of what is transpiring. So we are really lucky today to have two scholars with extraordinary skills to be able to talk to us about the dynamics of change and what these kinds of coca production and cocaine movement have actually meant, and how maybe to think about them rather than as narco terrorists, but rather as a dynamic of regional development. Our first speaker is Liliana Davalos. She is a Colombian. She has worked extensively in Amazonia and in the dynamics of deforestation. She has also worked on the questions of criminal governance and the integration, really, of drug finance and drug dynamics in processes, not of deforestation exactly, but how the funds are used as a dynamic in deforestation, as in the investment in cattle. Um, she has had many distinguished fellowships and so on, not the least of which is the Fulbright Amazonia Fellowship. And she also has been working for a long time at the interaction between biodiversity and society. Also, I would have to say she's a bat woman. She is a bat uh, promoter, so to speak, and has a lot of relations in promoting bat biodiversity. So when we say she's Batwoman, we don't necessarily mean what is normally understood by that term. However, she'll be our first speaker. And then we're also very lucky to have Renee Cordero, who is a assistant professor of history at Williams, who's a specialist on the Caribbean and particularly the Dominican Republic. He's working on a book, so this is a work in process, tentatively titled The Narco Atlantic: Race, Crime, and the Rise of Drug Capitalism in the Dominican Republic. So what we have is sort of two really important specialists who are looking at this not as some kind of story about narco terrorism, but rather as an outcome of failed and yet dynamic development processes of different kinds. Without further ado, let's go to Liliana.
All right. Thank you. Let's make this work. Okay. And hopefully it will work as planned. Okay.
There
So
we
just,
go.
yeah. All right. So thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to talk to this audience and to also share with Renee. I'm eager to hear what he has to say and for that wonderful introduction. So I have to start by saying that this project began long, long ago in 2022, actually, when I started writing about this. And the impetus for it was, of course, my interest in deforestation and environmental degradation throughout the Amazon region. And of course, Susana's work has been an inspiration of that, the logic of livestock being a citation classic for understanding some of those dynamics into the present. Little did I know that these dynamics would become salient in national security and that would be recast into some of these new ideas that new political ideas that Susanna was alluding to. So I'm going to stick to the environmental and the environmental side of things, and then I hope that we can have a discussion about this. So around that time, early 2020s, I started seeing a lot of these reports. So this report from Igarapé that's talking about environmental crime, and it's highlighting these dynamics, these processes, and then this culminated in 2023, the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, which of course has under its purview the censuses of coca cultivation and various other tracking of illicit economies, actually put out this chapter that was a standalone publication where they talked about the drugs and crime nexus. And so they were really interested in how there was this new dynamic. And then around the same time, we had this 2023, 2024, this is an ongoing project um, called the Amazon Underworld, where a set of a vast, sprawling network of journalists throughout Latin America is coming together and reporting on these stories in Portuguese and Spanish, as well as in English, and kind of tying together a story. So the idea was that these new criminal organizations or these new criminal networks in the Amazon were having a disproportionate environmental impact. Now, I was very skeptical about this actually. Going in, I was deeply skeptical, and the reason is that back in 2016, 2015, the United Nations had asked me to try to keep track of the environmental consequences of illegal drugs around the entire world. And of course, because of my own work in the Amazon and in the Andes, I was I actually kind of published subsequently. This is from the United Nations report focused mostly on the Andean countries. And what I discovered is something that, again, the logic of livestock, which was published in the 1990s, already talked about. And what it talks about is that these deforestation fronts that are happening in the Amazon Andes, or the Andes meets the Amazon, are actually mostly driven by frontier deforestation, where you're actually clearing in association with the expansion of the agricultural frontier, and you're converting these forests and these ecosystems, you're putting them into production in some kind of smallholder and occasionally into some large landholder dynamic, particularly things like soybeans in Brazil. But when you actually zoom in and you look at the coca producing countries of Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia, the vast majority of the deforestation is actually happening because of pastures. And the reason is not that you have this vibrant economy of cattle that's coming out of there, but rather because having the cattle gives you access to things like credit and gives you access to aspects of the illicit economy. And therefore, the deforestation that is actually happening because of coca for cocaine production is tiny in comparison. And so this is why I was rather skeptical of all of these narratives that were bringing crime as a new and unique and uniquely destructive dynamic, because I had this experience with coca and cocaine production as a relatively minor player in the deforestation that nonetheless caught a lot of attention, not the least of all by me. So I decided to ask some questions and try to put them into a research project. The first one is what has changed? What has changed about this market, this illegal market? How has it changed? Where has it changed? And what could you possibly do, especially so that it wouldn't be just all darkness. And then this is from a paper about concentration of wealth in the region and how it drives deforestation in the Amazon. Okay, so the first thing that I discovered is actually I decided to look into metabolite concentrations. And one of the things that I like to say is that the sewers don't lie. So it turns out the European Union has this very meticulous tracking of what's going into the sewers because of water quality. And because of that meticulous tracking, we can actually discover metabolites that are coming out of cocaine consumption, and we can track them over time. So what you're looking at here is the product. This is actually like a condensed version that looks at 16 years or so, where we actually see the increase. And you can see very clearly that these lines are rising in an exponential that is actually an annual rate of 16% of increase, which over the period of time that I'm looking at is increasing at 700%, a total of 700%. So it's risen. You also notice that each one of the colors corresponds to a particular sewer. And some of the sewers you see that don't have metabolites of cocaine early on, but then they start having metabolites of cocaine later down. So we see that something has dramatically changed about the quantities that are actually going into consumers in this data set. Now, we don't have a lot of data sets from other regions of the world that are expanding their consumption, and that's a subject of discussion. So then another line, trying to actually kind of think, okay, so this is something that has clearly changed. The demand seems to have changed. Look at what's happening in Europe, exponential rise in consumption as shown by the sewage system. So what is happening in Brazil? And in this, I've color-coded the legal Amazon of Brazil and put it into, once again, these are exponentials. These are, orders, powers of 10 that you're actually seeing in the horizontal, and fitted some function into them. And we see a 25% annual increase over the decade where we have these data. You can see that there's a dip in some of them after 2022. There's kind of a dip in some places like Rondônia or Acre. But look at Amazonas. Amazonas is, of course, bordering directly with Peru, Venezuela, and Colombia. And it just has this kind of very steep increase, which again gives us a 25% per year. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring in another market, because they are actually very, very tightly bound with each other. And that's the market for gold. So, and I call it the gold connection. It's the market for gold. And this is actually how much royalties the government is getting for gold from those states that supposedly that are actually reporting the gold. And now we see that there's a 36% annual increase. Again, these are exponential increases that are multiplicative over time, where you actually have gold circulating in the economy and rising, as you can see here. So in the first bit, I showed you how there's been an exponential increase in the consumption as we can track in Europe. And in this bit, I'm showing you that there is a exponential increase in the flow that is actually being captured by the police in Brazil. And it mirrors more or less how much gold is circulating as well. So to summarize a series of events, and I'm not including this latest wave of like 1 year of bombing and all of that, because I think it's really important for us to understand the processes that have taken us to this moment in the Amazon and the way that governance is operating. And so this is a brief history. You can see guerrilla groups acting in places like Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia, where the demobilization wasn't complete, and where groups like the ELN have never demobilized and have always had some of the territorial control into Venezuela. But we also have these prison gangs, and that's really important because these prison gangs had emerged out of Brazil, of developed areas of Brazil, like Rio and Sao Paulo, and are actually now operating at the borders and effectively control a lot of the trade that is happening with Colombia and with Peru. In fact, in Peru, we don't actually have as much of activity from other anything else, but some of the gangs that are coming. Of course, this is a sketch, a little bit of a cartoon of looking at the confluence of events. And we, of course, now have overlapping here with the period of time during which government interventions and activity were really scaled back because of the COVID crisis. The COVID crisis brought depopulation, and it brought a withdrawal of actual control, territorial control over vast parts of the Amazon. And we see how that plays into a consolidation across the borders, specifically the triple borders, that are all signaled here. The triple borders, of course, the one between Colombia, Peru, and Brazil is one of the most important, but we can also not forget the map, or Bolivia, Madre de Dios, and Brazil, and where this border is extremely active for gold, which again, bringing it back into the connection. So when we're thinking about this, so these are data from 2024 that's compiled by Inside Crime, that's kind of showing us how earlier on, Susanna was alluding to the Atlantic and the boats, the tiny little boats, or so-called tiny little boats. And so there is this sort of presumption that a lot of the trafficking is just through the Caribbean to the United States. And of course, that's still happening. But we actually have this expansion that goes all the way through Madre de Dios, all the way to the Pacific, and of course, the ports in Europe, where we actually recording high levels of activity and violence in places like Rotterdam and Antwerp, especially in Belgium. We can see that. So at this point, you might be wondering, what's this biologist doing with all of this? Where is the connection to the environment? Here's the connection to the environment, because when we look at places like the borders between Peru and Brazil, in Brazil, we're having this, in Peru, we're having these heightened levels of deforestation that are concurrent with this consolidation. So there's this vertical integration between the production, which used to be a smallholder production, is no longer a smallholder production in some places like in Ucayali. That smallholder production for Coca is relatively left behind, and now there's greater production that's actually under the Comando Vermelho. So it's under control of some of these prison gangs that I was alluding to earlier. So it's been this change, and it tracks greater deforestation premium. So back in 2013, the Organization of American States came up with the scenarios for the drug problem in the in the Americas. They envisioned this future drug policy, and this is a document that is fascinating because it's bringing together former presidents, judges, activists. It's bringing people from all kinds of walks of life that are thinking about drug policy and very little about the environment, but they're all thinking about this, and some of their ideas were remarkably prescient. So so if we look at this, they're thinking about these four different scenarios, and these four different scenarios are different in what they think about the drug problem and what are the challenges. And so I want to summarize real quick because you don't have time to read all of this. Is that in the together pathway, we have more enforcement. But one of the challenges is that the balloon effect will make it so that the criminal activities go from places that have strong institutions to places with weaker institutions, which is exactly what has happened. This movement towards the Amazon is a movement that's happening in part because there's greater enforcement and strengthening of the enforcement. These pathways, the idea was that there were going to be more experiments in policy. In resilience, there would be more social investment. That's not a real thing that we've seen. But under disruption, it's fascinating because then the idea is that we would see more division. The countries would kind of pull away and try to do different things because they are bearing the brunt of violence and social problems, and therefore they would pull away from this prohibition regime. And we actually see some of this. Possible capture of states by criminal organizations, which is something that definitely has occurred at local levels and occasionally rises to federal levels in some of the countries, and conflicts over violations for international treaties, not quite as much, but we actually see this reduced enforcement. And why do we see this reduced enforcement? Partly because of the COVID crisis. We have a relatively reduced enforcement, reduced footprint, and we have the signature of this. So if we try to think and look to the future, so one of the ideas was to try to craft these scenarios, thinking about demand rising, which is what we have now, versus demand declining, and more prohibition enforcement and less prohibition enforcement, and mapping these options across them. And so, again, to summarize, we can have many ideas about how this would work, is that in the context of this rising demand that's happening in places like Europe and others besides, particularly across the Pacific, we actually have, if we are going to do more prohibition investment, enforcement, there's actually this CCPI Amazon that started in 2023 that's investing about 3.5 million, 3 million per year. But in a single year in Pará, a single one is doing like almost 100 times that. So in other words, the investment that is going into this enforcement, this prohibition enforcement, is actually not at all commensurate to what's happening. Now, if the demand were declining, which it isn't, then it really depends whether we're controlling this ruralization, which is one of the names that this process of frontier expansion of deforestation, and ending, of course, this networks, these criminal networks, because it turns out these criminal networks aren't only trafficking in cocaine. Gold is a very important part of what they do, and there's also timber besides, and even fish. And we can go into the fish later. But if we actually had less prohibition, if we have a less, we're thinking about new policy alternatives, then with the rising demand, if we still have the criminal control in place, then we can replace the drugs with other crimes that I just mentioned. And then if the demand were declining for cocaine, then we would have to require monitoring because of the targeting of the gold market. So what these all base scenarios teach us, even though I know that a bunch of them are quite unrealistic, is that relaxing the cocaine prohibition, which is a thing that pops up every now and a falling demand, which is a thing that hasn't happened yet and is actually quite the opposite now, they don't necessarily curb the conservation impacts the way we would hope. Why? Because there are policy gradients across the application. This has been studied very well between Brazil and Uruguay with cannabis, and this can tend to undermine both countries and increase crime, or the markets bifurcate into legal and illegal portions like we have gold right now. A lot of the gold is illegal, but can you really trace it? We don't have good traceability. So traffickers can build what is known as economies of scope, in where they pivot from one illegal product to another, as they currently do with gold. So that's what we have to tackle. That's what needs dealing with, not just the cocaine as if it were like the only thing that's creating social problems in this part of the world. So the non-criminal social control requires environmental law enforcement that is agreed and coordinated in a transnational basis, and is also robust enough, which means investment and sustainable legal economic alternatives. Because of course, one of the reasons why we have cocaine in the first place is the lack of sustainability of other projects. So cocaine is just one product, and this is a photo that's really fascinating because I don't know how many people know, but this is like a Brazil-centric audience, so maybe people have heard about how Seve actually had some kind of technical control and had to be disbanded by the police, but this is all the way to south of Brazil, so it's not in the Amazon. So our technological capabilities have actually helped consolidate this criminal control, including drones and cryptocurrency, which are not mentioned here. Other commodities like gold, hardwoods, and wildlife, which are currently being trafficked. And therefore, the challenge is organized crime and these economies of scope. Thinking more about organized crime instead of terrorism, which is really a framework that's not adding anything and is actually kind of not really helping us localize the problem and tackle the problem. And it also doesn't help with any kind of coordination cross boundary. So what tools can profitably be used in a space where we're thinking about organized crime in the context of these cryptocurrencies? And with that, I would like to thank the Fulbright Amazonia for supporting this project. Thank you.
Wow, Liliana, thank you so much for going through this. The separation of various criminal activities, there's also land grabbing and so on that's going on in the context of all of this and various other mechanisms of money laundering. So
Mhm.
what we see is a kind of a bulwark of activities that are deeply intertwined and in which basically sending boots on the ground doesn't really do very much to help that. Um, and that these follow interesting economic laws. These are, after all, the freest of free markets in a lot of ways. Um, on that note, I have a question for you, but I'm going to save it until after Renee. So, Renee, why don't you start as well?
Thank you so much. Let me share my small PowerPoint here. Here, and then I go here. Is that visible for folks? Oh, no,
Yep,
no.
we can
Sorry.
see it.
Give me 1 second. That's not it. Here it is. Here it goes. Sorry. Thank you so much for having me. I feel really privileged to be here because this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time. As I'm, finishing my first book project, but this has been on my mind for a long time, as you will see. And I kind of want to start with this grisly story that happens in February 20th, 1979, where Harlem witnessed one of its most grim drug-related massacres in its history. On 128th East, 111th Street, seven Dominican nationals, six men and one woman, were bound and gagged before their throats were slashed. At least five of the victims were shot behind the head, and as one officer explained, they were mutilated with, quote, their heads scalped down the front with the nose cut off, end quote. A macabre display of violence. It even shocked investigative officers like Chief Martin McDuffie, who decried the New York slayings as, quote, one of the most vicious killings I've ever seen. So the massacre sparked outrage and horror across New York and then further south of the Atlantic in the Dominican Republic, where their bodies were flown down for a proper funeral. Officers carried a detailed investigation that compelled NYPD officers and FBI agents to expand their investigations by visiting the barrios of Santo Domingo, where some of the victims were from. But overwhelmed by post-industrial crime within NYC, the massacre's investigation lost steam, and detectives chalked up the killings to a wider turf war between the infamous Nicky Barnes, the widely celebrated African-American kingpin, and an increasingly intractable migration of Dominican drug workers, which began to overtake New York drug markets since the early 1970s. Now, my encounter with this micro story from the underworld of drugs' clandestine economy contains an eerie personal bent. One of those brutally slain, whose body was disfigured beyond recognition, was actually my long forgotten uncle, whose death was always shrouded in mystery until this brush with the archive. Now, Jose Oteros, alias Pico, my uncle, met his lethal encounter that day as part of an emerging drug economy that engulfed Dominicans and Caribbeans more broadly at its center, marking an economic, cultural, and social shift in Dominican political life. I think Jose's life serves as a microcosm of a much neglected history of how drugs utterly transformed Dominicans' relationship to migration, the global economy, and the rise of the post-Cold War political order. So, my this book project, this new book project that I'm just researching and reading a lot about, and which historian actually Paul Gutenberg has helped me think through so much. It seeks to understand how to locate the descent of revolutionary and anti-capitalist imaginaries that fueled the Caribbean and Latin America to what we are living now. This sort of political disenchantment, this social disenchantment, privatization. And it tries to track this continent's disruption of social and behavioral norms and the consummation of a neoliberal governing consensus of the 1990s and 2000s. Regardless of where one stands in the debate over whether the island was worse or better before or after neoliberalism, one thing remains undoubtedly true. Something changed for better or worse in the Dominican Republic and throughout Latin America, throughout the latter half of the 20th century. The very barrios and neighborhoods, or working class neighborhoods and ghettos, that once teemed with the fervor of political and cultural anti-capitalist imaginaries were, by the 1980s and 90s, the site of drug peddling and abuse, social insecurity, crumbling education systems, gang violence, and political apathy. Gone were the days that my parents and uncles reminisce about, where one could rest their head on a park bench after a night of revelry and wake up to the pleasant concerns of neighbors. Dissipated are also the unusually young and precocious youth leaders, exclaiming in complete and informed sentences the latest abuses of the state. Also gone are the traditions of historically rural populace whose customs and traditions were tied to land and passed down knowledge. So, how did these changes occur so as to render the country and many parts of Latin America unrecognizable in the span of just 30 years? And I think we haven't really dealt with this transition because we're just really at the peak, at the tip of the iceberg. I don't presume that the drug trade has all of the answers to my questions, but it is a necessary starting point for understanding this massive transition from a country whose location few could spot on the map to the cultural and political prominence it now holds in the global imagination and the northeastern Atlantic landscape, right? The Dominican Republic is the largest transit point, water transit point of drugs from South America to the United States. And as you all know, uh, Donald Trump used the Dominican Republic as the platform from which to launch the military attacks in the Caribbean. And so, since the 80s, something that once was anathema because of global 60s revolutionary politics is now a consensus of U.S. Dominican intimacy in this global order. So this book tries to do a couple of things, right? First is the idea that the drug crisis in the U.S. has overshadowed the extent to which drug abuse across Latin America reshaped social life. Um, You'd be surprised the deluge of letters and the apocalyptic scenes that concern mothers, pastors, and community groups raced to tame the scourge of drug abuse in neighborhoods that once flourished with youth cultural exchanges. So this idea that the drug crisis in the terms of substance abuse is only happening in the United States is also one that has overshadowed the kinds of damage that it has done to social life in the Caribbean. So what this book is trying to do is to show that drugs were also used to be consumed in the Caribbean and Latin America. And so it kind of tries to undermine the argument of the supply and demand. And we know that there is the demand is greater in the United States, but it does not necessarily mean that there is not a drug problem of consumption in Latin America and the Caribbean. But two, though, As the legitimacy of leftist visions began to wane by the 70s and 80s, for many reasons, but namely due to widespread corruption within liberal parties and so on and so forth, and that's another whole book. Those that were once the anti-heroes of Dominican politics emerge as the nation's saviors by the 80s and 90s. And this is where it gets really interesting for me because those who were because of this sort of revolutionary upheaval of the global 60s, as Eric Zoloff and other Latin American historians argue, those who were sort of exiled to the margins of Dominican politics returned in the 80s and 90s as the saviors of Dominican politics because of their drug warrior ethos in relation to the drug trade. And this is the biggest irony of all, is that, you know, this rise of these anti-heroes becoming heroes marked a sinister convergence between social conservatism in battling the drug trade and a wide acceptance of neoliberal government. Families and houses, once writhing in pauperism, were now rising dramatically and numerously into middle-class accoutrements. As one journalist observed in San Francisco de Macorís, one of the sort of where Dominican drug actors were mostly coming from. Dilapidated houses, once held up on stilts and rusted wood, were now lavishly adorned on slabs of concrete and reliable running water. You know, this drastic and social economic change that the drug trade spawned in Dominican society demonstrate a much more complicated scenario of the drug enterprise, one which pitted a multitude of motley actors and scales against and collaboration with each other. First, Dominican drug workers and capitalists did not expand to the scales of cartel proportions. That's important to maintain. And as this presentation is going to show, I think there's an importance in transshipment societies that can, that can really add and contribute a new perspective to our overwhelming knowledge of the producing countries. Dominicans operated as convenient distributors and subsequently championed novel ways of disseminating crack cocaine during the mid to late 1980s. Their positionality within the drug trade harkens to Paul Gutenberg's explanation of cocaine's emergence as a set of economic, political, and cultural, quote, flows, instead of merely a response to the supply and demand for drugs in the U.S. context. Dominicans' insertion in the drug trade emerged just as much because of overlapping political, social, and cultural processes as it did because of the set of economic rules of supply and demand. Second, the drug trade and the politics of drug abuse entered public discourse within a charged Cold War environment. Concerns about how drugs were fraying the moral codes of respectability in Dominican culture mobilized different sectors of Dominican society. While different groups heatedly debated their approaches to taming drug abuse and narco traffickers, they built a broad consensus around the idea that the emergence of drug culture originated from the United States' cultural penetration in the Dominican Republic. So, as you know, the U.S. invasion of 1965 accelerated this introduction of drug or estupefacientes, como lo dicen allá, of drugs in the Dominican Republic. And it put them, and this is where sort of my third biggest contribution of the book lies, is that it put them in close association with this really interesting phenomenon that started to happen in the late 70s and 80s, which was the Colombian-Dominican collaboration in the Haitian-Dominican border region of the Dominican Republic. It's fascinating because what I saw and what I'm seeing in this research is US's concern, particularly Charles Rangel concern of having the Dominican Republic become the Colombianization of the Dominican Republic. So US observers were seeing how Colombian drug migrants were using the Haitian Dominican borderland in order to more effectively distribute these drugs, right? So from the early 1970s to the late 90s, Colombian drug organizations, in particular the Medellin and Cali cartels, found in the unexploited borderlands of Hispaniola and its ports a propitious geography for drug distribution. By the late 80s, dozens of Colombians would be seen trafficking through the borderlands of Haiti and the Dominican Republic with ease. Drug trafficking through the border transformed provincial towns as drug consumption and selling became the dominant economy following the continuous exodus of countryside residents into major cities. During the crack cocaine craze of the mid 80s, Colombian actors also found another strong base of the Dominican working class to continue its final distribution in the United States, specifically in northeastern cities like New York. So I'm drawing on sources from state drug control agencies and letters from Dominicans living through this period. I show that the Colombian and Dominican connection through the geography of the Haitian-Dominican borderlands demonstrates this sort of Black Atlantic's importance to the emerging literature of drug histories. I want to show you, this is sort of a contemporary to the contemporary period. This is sort of a map that the UN had drawn about Dominican Republic remaining the largest transit point for cocaine. And this is a very fascinating. I really love this poster drawn in 1977 as cocaine and crack is becoming a really big problem in the country. You're seeing within a decade the transition from this being a marginal problem to a bigger and bigger problem. And so this poster was posted frantically in tourist transported spaces across the country, and it reveals the Dominican state's explicit biases and desperate approaches to drug control. The second stipulation, B, of the poster drew on a globalized image of hippie culture, which for Dominican authorities conjured the archetype of young, quote, persons in the 20 to 30 age bracket, as you see here, and in particular, male youngsters with long hair, beards, mustaches, and moderate or highly informal clothing, right? So this was sort of the drug actor of the late 70s who were being persecuted in airports as port cities like Puerto Plata, Santo Domingo, and places in Punta Cana in the east were starting to be flooded with drugs. So as early as 1972, Colombian drug actors were haltingly installing drug distribution routes through Santo Domingo's ports. The Dominican Vice Consul in the Dutch Antilles warned of these potential drug routes after a botched transport of 9 kilos of cocaine were found in a Colombian's national suitcase in Curaçao. Her name was Isabel Vega Beltran, a female Colombian drug transporter who confidently and carelessly, according to the reports, walked around with multiple kilos of cocaine in the Curacao airport and planned to take the drugs to Santo Domingo. The vice consul, in sort of this clairvoyant voice, warned policymakers, saying, I suspect that they, Colombians, are trying to introduce cocaine into our country for the sale or reshipment to other countries in the Americas. Because lately, some Colombian nationals have been inquiring about details about how to travel to Santo Domingo. This is 1972, a foreshadowing of what we're going to see in a bit. On how it's going to become, how drugs are going to begin to flood the Dominican Republic. So by the 80s, drugs were no longer merely a commodity for the consumption of marginalized actors, but a merchandise of pervasive value that was nevertheless profoundly shaping Dominican society. This was because Colombian, Haitian, and Dominican actors had perfected the use of the Haitian-Dominican border for cocaine smuggling. It was becoming a common occurrence for the Dominican National Police to find Colombians and Haitians working together to cross the border into the Dominican provinces. In 1986, Colombian citizen Luis Ignacio Ruiz Cortés was found alongside Haitian citizen Juan Roberto with 15 kilos of cocaine. They plan to cross into the northwest border province of Jimani, and from there, either transport the cocaine to Santo Domingo or sell it in smaller quantities throughout the region. So while we don't know much about Cortés and Roberto, I'm still doing the research on that. The collaboration between these two seemingly distant drug actors illuminates the allure of the border region for the illicit cocaine trade. To smuggle through the Haitian-Dominican borderlands was actually a very treacherous endeavor. The rugged, arid, and steep lands of the region are highly unfavorable contexts, made worse by the searing heat of summer days. The lack of vibrant social life and entertainment industry made the Borderlands region even more desolate, bereft of any kind of all those pleasures that the high affluence of narco traffickers could generate. And yet, more and more Colombians were willing to risk the move to these harsh regions, mingling about with the local peasantry while smuggling millions of dollars of cocaine. Cortés and Roberto's capture made headlines, and their presence in the country confounded the public as their operations indicated the country's steady lurch into a regional cocaine trade. Special segments on radio stations with alarming titles like Narco Trafficking, an Affront to State Authorities, published the stories of Cortés and Roberto and their more insidious connection to the Avianca airline, which Colombian drug actors took control of for their frequent flights to the Dominican Republic. For those who had been sheltered from the lived experience of the drug trade, hearing about how Colombians were intrepidly introducing millions of dollars in cocaine to the country conjured images of imminent social disrepair at the scale of the cartel violence that was rocking Colombia at the period. As the host of the provocative sentence segment put it, in a society which only a few years ago was free from the perturbation of this calamity, the Dominican people are observing with great worry the steady ascent of drug trafficking. Now, this is very interesting because, as you could recall, the ones who assassinated the Haitian president, the defunct Haitian president, in a couple of years back, I think in 2022, 2021, were Colombian mercenaries, right? And so this is not new. This sort of dates back to the late 70s and early 80s as Colombian cartels and the Dominican hinterlands, borderlands, made a really interesting mix, a successful mix um, um, in the Dominican Republic and even in the United States. I want to finish with this. This is a really sort of part of the worries that were going on during this time, and newspapers were riddled with this sort of apocalyptic scenes, and the letters that Balaguer was receiving um, uh, was filled with these illusions. And here I show a little bit about sort of the economic pathways and drug pathways from Colombia, Venezuela, and Panama um, um, in the Dominican Republic. This is fascinating because these were the two biggest drug warriors of the 80s and 90s. Enrique Pérez y Pérez and Joaquín Balaguer were, for most of the 60s and 70s, really repellent figures in Dominican anti-capitalist mobilizations and global 60s um, movements for social transformation. Enrique Pérez y Pérez, murdered and massacred a lot of people through his extra-legal gangs, La Banda Colorada, and Joaquín Balaguer was the dictator of the 60s and 70s that claimed the lives of a lot of young people. After Joaquin Balaguer is overthrown in 1978 or overthrown through elections, as the U.S. had to intervene in order to ratify that election. Enrique Pérez de Pérez also leaves as well, but they return in 86 as drugs are invading the Dominican Republic and assume sort of the vanguard against these two individuals. So you can literally see that you have individuals during the 60s and 70s, far leftist folks, who are allying themselves to Joaquin Balaguer and Enrique Pérez y Pérez in the name of fighting against drug trafficking. So drug trafficking becomes to build a consensus around this social conservatism, but also this political conservatism that gets overtaken in the post Cold War order. So as the United States is using the Dominican Republic as one of its main financial political partners in combating the Caribbean transshipment routes. You literally have these actions that would have been impossible in the 60s and 70s, like the Caribbean Basin Initiative, and you have, all of these military bases being ratified around the late 80s in the Dominican Republic, and sort of the Dominican Republic being used as a geographic launching pad for drug interdiction. This would have been impossible in the 60s and 70s. And so you even had during the Giuliani period um, uh, proposals to create an expansion of the New York City Police Department in Santo Domingo, as drug workers from Santo Domingo were overtaking these distribution and selling routes in New York City. As you can see here, in one of his usual televised antiques, Giuliani and State Senator Alfonso D'Amato made their way to Washington Heights in July of 1986. Washington Heights, as we know, is peopled by Dominicans by and large, and with camera crews in tow and both donning confiscated Hells Angels jackets. As you see in the picture, Giuliani showed the public how easy it was to purchase a vial of crack in Washington Heights. As they effortlessly accomplished the task of buying crack, their political theater stunt hoped to discredit Afro-Latino neighborhoods, casting them as the sole culprits of drug abuse, proving the need for mandatory prison sentences. No matter, as historian Garskoff points out, that Wall Street executive in their posh towers swam in a sea of all sorts of drug consumption. The attention on Washington Heights was a deliberate choice. Others sympathetic to Giuliani's mission, like policeman James McLaughlin, followed suit by claiming that 1 out of 5 Dominicans between the age of 19 and 35 were involved in the crack trade. And so this story intends to end by the 2000s, as drug distribution after the 90s and after all of these interdiction police surveillance systems, it increases instead of decreases, right? And so it goes back to show what Gutenberg in a lot of his work shows, that, this idea of crack cocaine interdiction and repression seems to just increase the desire for this trade. I'm going to stop it right there, and I'll receive questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your interventions, both of you. One of the things that I used to live in Humboldt County, the sort of in the Emerald Triangle. This was the center for marijuana production in the United States. And of course, there were lots of questions about the black market, the contraband market. But one of the things that happened was, of course, the legalization of marijuana, which produced actually an economic explosion of many kinds and many forms of using marijuana products in part of this whole story. And one could argue that its legalization sort of fostered a huge innovation dynamic with everything from, I don't know, bath salts to arthritis cures. My question for you, and this is one that's also raised by President Petro of Colombia, which is, why don't we just legalize coca? You can capture the taxes. You can control it much more easily in theory. This is not that the black market doesn't go away, but in any case, it changes a lot of the dynamic. And so my question for you, and also a lot of the violence that's associated with it, both from the state and from the practitioners and so on, the illegal, how do we say, the illegals in the narco economy. So I'm curious about what you might have to say, and I don't know whether Paul is on, but it would be great if he would like to comment as well. So what if this is if it's allure and it's dynamic and it's violence, whether state violence, international geopolitical violence, or whatever it is, could be addressed through legalization, why not legalize it? We have the marijuana example. Anybody want
I don't
to?
know if Renee wants to talk about it. I mean, um,
I'll let you, yeah, go first. I have my.
so I can say that I think that the idea of running these scenarios was precisely to try to address that question. So I'm of course sort of I have my own perspective that comes from the idea of forest conservation and ecosystem conservation as a the lens through which I'm examining that question as to what that would do, and that's why I wanted to in the paper examine what the consequences of a possible range of legalization. But I do want to share something that from my experience sort of working. So in 2016, I think, the United Nations General Assembly was uh, met, and it was a revisit of the international framework to that is the reason why different countries share a similar um, sort of lists of substances and what they're supposed to enforce and what the cross-national thing. And it was really fascinating because, of course, I'm based out here in New York, and in New York, there was this buzz in the air in 2015. And this buzz in the air were a lot of people, a lot of scholars coming from fields like geography and history, sort of working and presenting work in the idea, and they generated dozens of pamphlets and documents and working papers and working under the idea of legalization. There was also, like I alluded to, this 2013 report from the Organization of American States, and that was a very strong, a former president of Colombia was like part of it. And that's movements to kind of like raise it, like in South America is where people are dying, all for this regime. And I arrived in Vienna to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, and the first thing that I asked is like, what is basically all the buzz in New York City is how the General Assembly is actually going to contemplate an overhaul or change in this international policy that is not up to individual states, though we can get into the weeds about how domestic politics can actually change some things. Um, and what are you guys thinking? Like, are you thinking, like, are you getting ready for this? And the answer, if these people weren't extremely polite and professional, I think they would have laughed in my face because they said, there's 13 countries in South America. How many countries are in Africa? Right? And I think in so many words, what I understood from the time that I've been sort of working in some of these things is that one of the things that these international treaties do is they serve as um, mechanisms of exchange of resources at the state level, right? And therefore, if you have 50 odd countries in Africa that are getting some money out of this, right? And you have 13 countries in South America that are also getting something out of it, but they're also seeing the destruction of their human capital and the destruction of their structures and all of that, and maybe want to change that, right? That there's just not enough momentum to shift that table. So that's at the very high level. And of course, individual countries do have latitude to change. They have latitude to decriminalize. They have latitude to do those things. But in this superarching structure that would in effect enable countries to enter into huge disputes and legally, although I know that that's not something that's going to constrain some countries in their actions, but legally in this international structure that would enable countries to effectively affect each other and attack each other over this, at that structure, there is simply no momentum whatsoever. There wasn't then, and there isn't now. None whatsoever for doing that. Now I'm going to get back to my actual purview and the actual research that we did. It's very interesting that you bring cannabis, because one of the things that we did I wanted to stay grounded in reality rather than being grounded on, just like Rene cited some of his personal experience. I grew up in a Colombia that was completely racked by the constant threat of violence coming from the drug trafficking business, filtering into all kinds of life. I literally, like judges were killed and journalists were killed and and candidates for president were killed, and senators were killed, and ministers of justice were killed. And that's what a lot of people in South America mean when they say we are the ones putting the dead bodies, because we are. Our entire
Mm.
society lost pretty much a generation of the bravest, boldest people, the ones that had a strong sense of justice. They were murdered. We have monuments to that in places like Medellin, of all places. We have monuments to that where there's a giant wall and there's holes and light filters through them. And every light, every one of those points of light is a dead body that was put there by. So I have to overcome my own visceral reaction to the vision of that, overcome that, and think as a scientist and as a scholar, what are some experiences that we have where we have decriminalization or legalization, and how did that play out? And cannabis is a really good example because it's actually the literature on that, both in the United States and the cross border of United States and Canada, and in between Brazil and Uruguay, teaches us a couple of things. On the one hand, between the United States and Mexico, some of this cannabis legalization has had an effect of reducing violence. But when it comes to the United States and Canada, when Canada decriminalized first, it's actually the smuggling business actually kind of pivoted into more violent things like opiates, right?
Mm.
And in between Brazil and Uruguay, it actually also rise in criminality. So Brazil doesn't liberalize, doesn't decriminalize, but Uruguay does. And now we see actually like an increase in the smuggling that is involving cocaine, all that. So we don't have a very clear indication. We actually have a very patchy, that's very circumstantial and really depends on the countries and depends how it's enforced and depends what the organizations are doing. So in the setting that I'm describing of these transnational networks that are already smuggling gold, that
Mhm.
are already trafficking wildlife, that are already trafficking timber, the idea that this kind of single policy lever is going to disarticulate them is at this time actually fairly naive. Perhaps there was a time when this policy level would have been super strong. That time is not now.
Yeah, really good point.
I want to jump in on that because this is a
Sure.
point, Lena. As I'm contemplating this project, I'm like, man, for the Caribbean, this takes on a quite interesting take because we shouldn't underestimate the body and finance and power that the state receives from these interdiction technologies and from being, I mean, the kinds of benefits and subsidies that the Dominican Republic has earned, particularly being seen as the miracle of the Caribbean, right? Always being compared to Cuba and Haiti in terms of how it has fallen into the good graces of both the Trump administration, but even from the Reagan administration all the way up to the Trump administration through these large investments in drug interdiction. And so the Dominican Republic has become the darling of these large interdiction efforts and has reaped handsome benefits, for very few people, but has reaped handsome benefits at the state level in doing this. And so in this middle, in sort of this uh, middle ground place, what I call these transshipment contexts, which are not suffering the cartel-like violence, but are also suffering the very larger social political consequences. This conversation of legalization is just out of it's not even in the purview of a lot of these folks. And then there's also cultural stuff, right? I mean, um, Dominicans can drink their liver to death, right? But cocaine, absolutely not, right? Like there's a big drinking problem in the United States, but cocaine and drug abuse are seen as something that has to remain in the realm of the illicit, of the illegality. There's also this really interesting connection I'm trying to make, and Robin Derby's new book, the Borderlands book, is helping me with that. In that contraband and the illicit economy were part and parcel of Hispaniola history, right? Hispaniola was the center of this contraband culture and pirate culture and filibuster culture. And I am not surprised that it became the context in which the Cali and Medellin cartels used in order to stage a lot of their larger distribution networks to the United States. So this is a longer American history of geopolitical contraband that has the Haitian Dominican borderland at its center.
Just to leap in here quickly on the question of Amazonia has always been also a contraband
Right,
area.
right.
So there is the sort of, there was certainly a lot of inter-regional trade from the beginning, but then what you have, pre-Columbian routes and so on. But then what you have is that it has been a contraband nation really for a long time with with moving legal and illegal, the merging of the legal and the illegal in lots of different ways. I think it's interesting, and this is something that both of you brought up, was the question of frontiers as
Mhm.
being sort of central and in these dynamics, which is that the areas of weakest governance become the areas in which these counter forms of governance emerge in unusual ways. And so, in a certain sense, what you can see is that you have a governance and a power void, which is then filled with the taxes, if you will, associated with contraband, various kinds. So it's a really interesting
Yeah.
comparison.
There was a question here on about.
Yeah, we've got questions. I'm going to shut up. I just wanted to
No,
get my burning questions in. So let's go to the audience here.
Renee, you want to take Robin's question?
Yep, yep, yes, yes, absolutely. And Robin, I mean, we're always in a conversation about these things, but yes, right. The Haitian gangs is one of the way. Oh, Brian, was that?
I'm sorry, the audience is actually not able to see the question Robin submitted to the chat.
Oh,
So I'm gonna go ahead
okay,
and read the chat.
absolutely. Okay,
Robin Derby from UCLA's History Department says, "Thank you for your fascinating presentations. I have a question for Renee. Are the gangs in Haiti which control the port involved in trafficking today?"
and not only in trafficking, of course, right, drugs, but in trafficking all kinds of things. I always say, like, Haiti doesn't produce bullets nor manufacture guns, right? Trafficking is at the heart of the gang problem, and drug trafficking in particular is one that is feeding both the if you look at Dominican Republic, right, you'll see Pedernales, you'll see Dajabon, and you'll see the border region, and the border region is rife with both, as has been since the 17th century from the east to the west, right? And then from back to the west to the east. And so this unsurveilled border region has been at the forefront of sustaining the power of Haitian gangs, both through drug trafficking, but also through the weapons that usually would also come in through the north of the Dominican Republic, as well as through the still unpopular, sparsely populated region of what we call the Deep South.
So I want to take on a question that Paul Gutenberg asked. He says, how can we bring together and compare and connect these two distinctive transshipment arcs, Pan-Caribbean and the increasing shifting south, I called it, movement from the Andes through the Amazonia to Brazil, European and Asian consumers? And I have a one-word answer, Venezuela.
Wow. Well, that shuts everybody up.
I know, right? Top clocks. Yeah. Actually, but again, what follows from it is not what has happened to
Mhm.
Venezuela. What follows from it is understanding what's actually happening on the ground, right?
Mhm.
And so, in the if anybody caught the DOI of what I have, that's a preprint, and I describe in there, or we describe in there actually, like a lot of the trajectory of how mobilization through Venezuela has become this very important, and also triangular trade that involves cocaine, guns, and gold,
Hmm.
right? And the operationalization of that through these cross-border, networks that are involving on the Brazilian side, the prison gangs on interactions with the Colombian non-demobilized former guerrillas, and the sort of simultaneous heavy hand of the Venezuelan regime, but its lack of real territorial capacity in its borderlands, as none of the countries can really assert very clearly, except for maybe Brazil and maybe in some places. And so Venezuela takes us there. Yeah.
One of the things that has just been signed is an agreement between Venezuela and various United States the commercial organizations associated with gold. And
Oh,
the idea is that the gold would go into these and be smelted in the US. I think right now most of that gold either goes into um, the Arab world, particularly
mhm,
Dubai, but also Switzerland.
mhm.
Switzerland is
And
the
this is not surprising because gold has this dual nature, right? The gold as one of the challenges to traceability is the fact that it is an element. So when it's actually pure, there's no way to figure out
yeah,
whether it's it's
where it's
it's
from.
legal or not, and where it's from. And that gives it this, and it's also, the more upheavals that we have with the stock market and political upheaval, the more there is a fleeing to gold. I had a graphic that showed, I didn't show it because sometimes it's distracting. We have the exponential metabolites in cocaine coming out, but we also have the price of gold. And the
Hmm.
price of gold this last year, with all the drama and political upheavals that we keep experiencing globally, gold broke $5,000. And
Yeah.
that's like in the history of the world, that has never happened.
No.
In the history of the world, I'm going to say that again. In the history of the world, right? Like that has never happened. And the more that gold rises, so the more upheaval we see, the more the price of gold becomes a refuge. More people pour money into gold, and more gold comes out of the Amazon, right?
Mhm.
And with more gold coming out of the Amazon, it's kind of fascinating to hear that there are these sort of, let's call them trade agreements, right? Because those are definitely part. Gold is part of a triangular trade as it
Mhm.
stands.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, it will be interesting to see because we'll have a gold session a little bit later on in May. With people who've been following, people like Matt Feiner,
Hmm.
Liliana, who
Oh
take
yeah.
on
Yep.
this whole question of looking at where the gold is being extracted and
Hmm.
its relationship to conservation. But what we can also see is that in the face of kind of failing governance within the Andean states themselves, I mean, I think the most recent Peruvian president lasted for 4 months or something. Um, that the capacity of governance even within the capital cities is quite limited, and this is of course at sub-regional jurisdictions it becomes
Yeah.
even less powerful. In which case, once again, we get this problem of power voids within sort of sub-regional jurisdictions with sort of complete takeovers in many areas. Have we got more questions?
I
Renee's raising his
I
hand.
actually have a question, well, unless no one else in the audience has a question. Yeah. Let me see.
I can't see.
I can't see. All right, cool. I'll go ahead and as I'm researching and writing this book tentatively and through spurts, I wonder, do y'all have any idea on how to think through talking about people who didn't want to be found? um, Actors who are doing the smuggling. These are people doing this, right? And I wonder, to what extent is it worth going down that route of actually looking at the individual actors or group actors who are involved in the smuggling, or do we think about this from a bird's eye view context, or is this more of a micro history? I'm a firm believer that actors make history and there's the contingencies and all these other things. But I wonder, how do y'all deal with that? How do you deal with that, Liliana, in your work, if you do at all, and if there's any suggestions on how to go about that, right?
Yeah, so I don't I kind of tried for my Fulbright Amazonia. So you have to understand that what you're seeing is completely different than what I submitted.
Okay.
Because when I submitted, I was very interested in this idea of money laundering, and I was very interested in staying on my lane, in my lane of cocaine. I was very, that was my vision. My vision was I want to go beyond the hectares of coca that get planted, because those like the smallest potatoes in terms of both deforestation and the growers themselves are the least powerful in this chain. I'm interested in the fact that there are these giant money flows, and one of the best ways to launder the money is through land grabbing, right?
Mhm.
And I want to see some of that. So I was very surprised when I started having conversations with people who had their ear to the ground a lot more than I did, or less academic and more action oriented, to discover that the thing that kept tumbling out was always gold. I kept
Oh,
talking about the
Yeah.
illegality of cocaine and this model that I had brought with me from the 2010s, from the work that I had done in the 2010s of I kept going down this route of trying to think about the land grabbing and in which cattle play an important and cattle and grass play an important key role. And what kept coming out was like, why are we even talking about this? Like everything is gold all the time, everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Like it's gold, 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 gold. And so that was fascinating. I did a ton of paperwork to be authorized by the university to actually have some conversations with people that were more directly connected than I will ever be to what was happening. And all of that work never snowballed. And so it just never prospered. And so I had to outline conditions under which the conditions that would enable the anonymization of the individuals um, required a certain number, and that never got there. And so I could never get to
okay.
those individual histories the way that you're describing.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
there was like 4 months of paperwork went into it, so I can say
Yeah.
that.
Nice.
So it's fascinating to hear from you, the contingencies and the individual actors. Like I think if I had to, looking at the sort of history of PSC and CV, the two biggest gangs in Brazil,
Yeah.
I would be very interested to see what scholarship is coming out of that,
Hmm.
because like uh, your sort of interest in 1970s and the continuity and disruption between a culture and a people from that time until now, these gangs are that old as well.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And their move to the Amazon is way more recent, right?
Yeah, it's
Just
very
like
recent.
just like the FARC also have a completely
Yeah.
different history,
Yeah.
and the groups of the FARC that didn't demobilize in one of the things that if you kind of stay looking at the figure where I try to kind of synchronize all of these events into one picture, one of the things that you'll notice is that actually you don't notice there, and I don't say it, but I'm going to say it here, is that some of the fronts that didn't demobilize, they didn't demobilize. It wasn't like they came to the negotiating table and they were like, it's not a good deal for us. It was like the moment that there was a negotiation, they said, we're not part of it. They
Oh,
had too much at stake
Mhm.
already.
wow.
Yeah, like Mordisco, right? Who's like this pivotal character, right? Mordisco, it wasn't, one could think there's this demobilization happening and they just never got the agreement that they wanted. No, from the beginning, they were like, we're out of it. We're out of it. And I think that there's an economic logic there that makes sense and a
Yeah,
territorial logic that makes sense. And it
yeah,
didn't make sense for the vast majority of the FARC that did demobilize. It also made sense what they did, right? But for certain of these groups, it wasn't as if they came to the table and they were disappointed. It was like from the beginning, they knew what they had was way better than anything else. Right? And
Wow.
yeah.
that's fascinating. Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm sure you know the Selva Dentro. This is the history of the Guaviare occupation where people, in that, again, it comes out of a leftist political moment in which people moved into this part of the Amazon and were eventually became allied with FARC. And what you can see is that that was sort of a colono kind of thing, coming out
Yes.
of the, how do we say, do-it-yourself land reform.
Mhm.
Later, it becomes more politicized through FARC and so on. But you could certainly see that there could be a very strong bifurcation
Yes.
because of the value of and the lack of economic alternatives elsewhere, which is of course the
Mhm.
thing
Mhm.
that you and
Yeah,
Paul worked
yeah,
on, which
it's
is like, well,
fascinating.
what else are you gonna do?
It's really great that you bring that up, Susanna, because in preparation for this, like brushing up on my PSSA and CV, like on their history, right? Before coming here and talking about the role, what I discovered is like they actually had, well, I knew that they had an agreement and the agreement broke down and they started shooting whatever. That was something that I researched and wrote into the paper. But what I didn't know is that they had started out and their slogan literally had like peace was part of it. They were like in the when they originated in the prisons,
Hmm.
they wanted peace. They saw that their rights, they envisioned, so a little bit like that idealism of the guerrillas, right?
Hmm.
They started out with this idealism, right? And of course now they're a completely, they're a historical being, so they're evolving and they're like, this is not, but they started out as a kind of rights, like a human rights, with a human rights slogan. That's where they started, right? But that's not what they're now. Of course, no. Now they're entities that actually control very, very, very
Wow.
effectively vast regions of it. So I would be very, very interested in, just like Tito Fijo in Colombia, for example, has multiple biographers, right?
Hmm.
And that it's that connection that Susana is bringing up between the modern guerrillas and their rural colono, the rural kind of uh, landless campesino origin, right? And the press and what came after, decades after, which was very different. A character like Tiro Fijo, right? I'm not aware. I'm guessing that a lot of this literature is going to be in Portuguese, of
Hmm.
something similar happening with these organizations on the Brazilian side.
Yeah, there's a very interesting book. Since we're going into what is turning into the stronger commodity in lots of ways, which is this gold stuff, which
Mm-hmm.
is the book by David Cleary, Anatomy of a Gold Rush, which was written, I don't know, in the mid. It was about the Gran Carajás and the whole legal gold extraction through sort of terrible, terrible conditions. Um, Sebastian Salgado made many moving photographs of the conditions of these miners. But what's very interesting, and David Cleary is an ethnographer, is that what happened in the end was that these miners eventually went to the Tapajos and became there's this whole thing of kind of mining cooperatives and gold mining cooperatives. So there's a very complex dynamic going on here too between, for example, in the Bolivian case where you can have mining cooperatives for gold, but 50% of them can be Chinese. It can
Mm-hmm.
be a Chinese corporation that funds the other kinds of things. So one of the things I think is really interesting here is that certainly you have the sort of cartelization in the trade, but the forms of actual extraction remain much more complex. And so some of it's more freelance, so if you try to interfere with so-called artisanal wildcat mining in the Tapajos, you get sort of the impact of organized labor on you leave these guys alone versus the sort of indenturement that you see in the Madre de Dios. It's a really complex set of productive relations that are going on, and there's not sort of one size fits all. I would agree that the trafficking starts to be cartelized,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah.
but but within the actual production, I think it's much more dynamic.
Mhm, mhm,
But again, I'm part of a group based in Bristol, the UK, which is called Infracursions, which is actually a group of people looking at the whole dynamic of these small scale mining groups. So they just started. I was just in the UK a couple of months ago, and this group has just sort of sent out its postdocs and its students to start doing their research on these areas. But mainly in that area, the Triple Alliance area,
okay.
because that's where you can switch jurisdictions and where also many things are legal and many things are not legal, but you can mix them together and get, it's what I call Amazonian alchemy. You can just take stuff and switch it. You could turn lead into gold through a sort of a magic of going through a process, an incendiary process. But
Mhm.
do we have any more questions here?
We've got comments, I think.
Yeah, pretty much just comments.
Um, yeah.
Well, and we've gone past the hour. What we our classes often the lunchtime is noon to 1, noon to 2, so we can get people, but then people have to go off and teach classes, take classes, and so on. So, Brian, what do you think? Shall we close out? Do you guys have any final questions, comments? Renee, you're grinning like a
Yeah.
Cheshire cat.
My head is just is swirling with ideas now, and this is so helpful for me just thinking about all this stuff. I've always been fascinated by the visibility of the invisible illicit economy, and so I mean, I have so many thoughts, but I'm just my head is swirling with a lot of really good things, and I'm really excited to see where this book takes me and see where this book project takes me. And hopefully I have pleasant surprises like what Liliana experienced in her Fulbright research. So
Yeah, a completely different line of thought.
yeah, thank you for
Um,
letting me workshop this too. This is amazing.
No, it's great. It's great. We thank you both for taking the time. And also, we thank our audience for listening in. Um, I think this is a really complex time, and it's sort of interesting to have more field-based, concrete research since we're just getting a deluge of narrative that is kind of disarticulated from the realities that we're talking about. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the what lends this presentation its currency is the fact that I think we've got processes in place that are completely divorced from both policy and expertise, right?
mhm.
And that are definitely going to take us somewhere else, right?
Mm.
What that somewhere else is, I can't, because we can't really discern, exactly but important bits of information, like for example, the gold agreement or some kind of gold exploitation agreement are actually important pieces for
Mhm.
understanding what may come next. Because of course we know that gold is, that again, cocaine and gold are actually um, very dynamic commodities that are traveling together in these networks. And
Mhm.
therefore anything that dynamizes and makes it easier to get the gold out is also going to strengthen some of these routes, right? So
Mhm.
that's something that we can definitely be safe in
Assuming.
projecting. So I just put the DOI. This is the preprint. We're in the process of now breaking up this into two different articles, and so stay tuned. But the preprint is out there if you want to kind of sit more carefully and examine more carefully the logic of what I presented.
Yeah, I really do. I always, as I say, Lillian, I always follow your work.
Thank you.
And Renee, you've just walked into the sand pit here.
That's exactly what I wanted and needed and need to sort of spur me to continue this book project. So, I'm thinking of, article versions and stuff. I have so much that I've been compiling and so much that I've been reading that I kind of want to just sort of put myself out there and join the conversation with all of.
Renee, I'm gonna leave as Susanna said, I actually have this whole other life as a genomicist of mammals and especially bats. It's like this whole other existence in completely
Wow.
different conferences and completely different styles of analysis. But because of that work, I've traveled to the Dominican Republic quite a bit. I work with people, NGOs and this NGO that's based out of Pedernales has taken us a number of times. We can really see, I've really been able to see kind of like the way investment has worked out in that region with Oviedo, being like the sleepy town and now having electricity. But the anecdote that I want to tell is that this is an NGO, it's an environmental NGO, and they work a lot with sea turtles. And the little kids way back in the day, the little kids in the neighborhood, they had all their equipment was of course old. They got it through grants in the past, and now it was all like this little boat, really patched up and all of that. And the little kids would say, when my bale of cocaine arrives, I'm gonna buy you a new boat. Because it occurs with us at the time, it occurred with a certain regularity that
Yeah.
a random unclaimed bale of cocaine washed up in the Southern Dominican Republic, that the kids would talk about like the lottery. Yeah, when my lottery ticket wins, when the
Yeah.
bale of cocaine comes in,
Exactly how it is. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna buy you another boat. And I was like, okay, worlds colliding, but that's not the hat that I wear when I go to Lydia.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly how it is. Oh my God.
All right.
All right. Once again, thank you so much for your time and for this stimulating presentation. Boy, really a lot to think about and very unusual connections and overlaps. So on that note, I think we close out.
All right.
And
Yeah.
again, thanks so much.
For those who are still watching, our next event is going to be on Wednesday, May 6th at either 2 or 3 p.m. Pacific time. And and sort of our continuation of the discussion of Amazonian and Latin American, the sort of circulation of Amazonian and Latin American commodities. The next one's going to be about oil, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and
Awesome.
you will know, Liliana, you will know that Philip Fernside is going to be talking about it, and also from your work as well, the whole question of Susanna Sawyer and the oil economy of Ecuador. So they'll be our presenters.
Fantastic.
So don't miss it. We'll send you,
Oh, no, send
and
it. Send
Please.
we'll
it.
send you
I'm signing up for that. I'm signing up for the gold. It's
yeah,
awesome.
no, well,
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
coming the following the 2 weeks later. So.
Okay,
We're
fantastic.
just finalizing our presenters. So
Okay.
thank you again, and I guess we're um, uh, Brian. Would you like to say anything else?
No, I think that's everything. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. I put information in the chat for our social media if you'd like to follow us. And I assume everybody here is on our email list already, so you'll get emails soon about our next events. But thank you. Thank you to